my name is Kэti Dipvelл. I am the widow of Joseph Bakштейn, and I'm also the person who organised the donation of all his collection of books that were in his personal possession to the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Centre Library. And my reason for doing this is because it's a very unique collection. It has a lot of important and distinctive features which currently the library did not possess. So my husband was a bibliophile in the true sense of the word. He collected books, but not just because he loved them or thought they were important, but because they were directly relevant to his interest in ideas and his interest in contemporary art. Joseph Bakштейn trained as a sociologist. Well, his first training, ironically, was in electrical engineering, but then he retrained as a sociologist of culture. And in the 70s, he was very interested in sociology of culture, and he also worked for an architectural institute as a researcher. He started curating exhibitions in 1987, and the timing of his first curation is significant because it's also the beginnings of perestroika and the relationship between his work and the changing face of Russia in the period between 1988 and say 2015 is highly significant to the history of his work. So these are the kind of like parameters of the book collection. The book collection has many contemporary art catalogues. It also has a lot of theoretical textbooks because contemporary art requires art theory, philosophy, understanding of the history of art. You cannot work in this field without this background education. And this background education is quite critical. And Joseph was involved in educating other people as well as himself. And this is also reflected in the collection of books that he acquired in the last 20, 30 years. Joseph traveled extensively in his work, and the collection also reflects his travels. So he went regularly to Basel Art Fair, he went regularly to Venice, he went regularly to many international art fairs and exhibitions around the world. He went to Sydney Biennale, he went to Gwangju Biennale, he went to Sao Paulo Biennale. So he traveled the world thinking about and working with artists on contemporary art. So this is the later part of his career. It's very significant that his collection is here in the Jewish Museum because in this building he organised 3 exhibitions, and the catalogues of the 3 exhibitions are in front of me. So the first of these is the exhibition, An Alternative History of Art by Ilya Kabakov. And this exhibition catalogue is from the museum in Cleveland, which first organised the Rosenthal-Kabakov Spivak show as an alternative history of art. But there are many features of this exhibition which Joseph reproduced in the garage, which is the exhibition was an enormous installation, and it was a museum within a museum. And it engaged with a fictional history about the changes of contemporary art in relationship to Soviet realism. And it explored myths and legends about artistic identity and the story of a fictional character artist. This is all central to Kabakov's work. Now, my husband met Joseph met and worked very closely with Ilya Kabakov since the late 70s, I would say. And in the mid-1980s, he started a series of dialogues with Kabakov, some of which have been published. And they appear in Russian in books like this. But there are also several English translations in Kabakov's catalogues of these dialogues. And a new publication coming out is a trialogue between Kabakov, my husband, and Michael Epstein. This is about to be published. So this notion of a dialogue and a conversation about contemporary art is really critical to how we think about contemporary art. We don't just see it as a visual medium that we look at and walk away. We actually we think of contemporary art as a thinking medium. It's how we conceive of the world. And this idea of thinking about the world as a whole and being in conversation with other people in the world is very central to everything that my husband did. And it comes out in all the themes explored in the biennales that he organized. It comes out in the way he acted as a teacher for the Joseph Bachstein School of Contemporary Art. It comes out in his dialogues with artists whose work he curated over several years. And it particularly comes out in the conversations with Ilya Kabakov. So the other big exhibition that he organized in this building is the third Moscow Biennale. This is a very critical exhibition. It was curated by Jean-Hubert Martin, and Joseph was the commissioner of the Moscow Biennale and its founder. And the third exhibition was very spectacular, and it was a media phenomenon. And the fact that it was held in this building means it's quite interesting and important that the collection of books returns to this building. Joseph also played a part in the transformation of Garage to the Jewish Museum because he was a member of the Jewish Museum board. And he worked very closely with Maria Nosimova, who was the first curator of contemporary art at the transformed Jewish Museum. And the only exhibition that he organized here after it was transformed is this exhibition on contemporaries of the future. And Joseph organized, there are two other curators, and Joseph organized a section on contemporary art in this thing. And in this catalogue, there's a very interesting dialogue between Joseph and Lev Rubinstein. And we note with some sad irony that they died within a month of each other in 2024. And again, this theme of conversation and dialogue is really critical to this, because they are discussing in this conversation what is the relationship between the large numbers of Jewish artists who were attracted to and worked in the circle of Moscow conceptualism and the work that they produced. And they have different points of view about this subject, but what they draw attention to is very interesting as a problem. Joseph is part of a circle of Moscow conceptual artists who, in spite of ethnically being identified as Jews in the 1940s and 50s by Soviet government policy, they were interested in religion, but they were not religious. They were not regular synagogue attenders. Joseph is slightly different because his grandfather was a rabbi, but they did regard themselves as secular Soviet Jews, and their interest in what it meant to be a Jew is very much about the ways in which they were discriminated against in the 50s and 60s as they were growing up, in school, in education, and in where they lived, and the kind of jobs and professions that they were drawn towards or saw as a possibility. And they talk about the difference between this generation of Moscow conceptualism and unofficial artists of the time. Unofficial artists kept their distance from Soviet official culture, whereas this group of artists, the Moscow conceptual artists, saw the official culture as something that should be critiqued, played with, thought again about, criticized. And this is a feature of Moscow conceptualism and Sots art. Now, Lev Rubinstein points out a number of other features which occur repeatedly in this generation of Moscow conceptualism, conceptual artists. For example, a literary-centric point of view, a certain introverted characterization about language and daily life, there are some other features that they name in this interview, which is really very interesting for me to read. I mean, I did discuss what it meant to be Jewish in the Soviet Union at that time with Joseph. And when Joseph met people internationally and explained to them that to have the ethnicity Jew in your passport in the Soviet Union was common, most people in Europe were very shocked by this fact because of the Second World War. And this interview concludes with this very interesting point that both Lev and Joseph regarded themselves as different, but that difference was because of the way that they were treated, not because of how they existentially saw themselves in Soviet society. So this kind of like those moments of difference where discrimination as a Jew enters the picture and you are treated as a second-class citizen were of great interest to them. And Joseph also, because when he first started working as a curator, he took the Moscow conceptual artists to America. He very quickly started to understand that in New York, in particular, the attitudes of Jewish artists in conceptual circles in New York were very different. And they didn't regard being Jewish as a sign of shame or discrimination. They actually regarded it as a badge of pride. And he makes a few comments in here about meeting a lot of artists in New York in the early 90s and seeing a completely different set of attitudes. And I think that this is behind the internationalism that Joseph espoused as a whole in everything that he did. He was interested in a two-way exchange. And this is maybe the opening up of the Soviet Union in the post-perestroika moment, but he was interested in how. This was a key question that he always came back to. How can Russia integrate with the rest of the world? What are the cultural exchanges and possibilities for Russia to be part of the international art world? And if you look at the ways in which Joseph brought international artists to Moscow, exported Russian artists abroad, you can see very clearly a curatorial strategy which is a form of cultural diplomacy on a much larger scale. And that this cultural diplomacy is about developing understandings between people and gaining tolerance, which is also a key theme in everything that Joseph did. And I think it's an important part of his legacy. So if I return briefly to the theme of conversation, quite a few of the books that Joseph produced are actually from conferences that he helped to organize. This one is from the mid-90s. This one is from 2008, and it was a Biennale project. These represent from the ICA the teachers but also the dialogues that the teaching generated. So they're kind of part conference, part recording of the work of the teachers of the ICA. So Joseph's dialogues with people extended to the one article that we published together in NIFKA's magazine. NIFKA is an organization in Finland, and in this at this time in the late 90s, NIFKA ran a centre for artist residencies in Suomenlinna, which is a very small island off Helsinki. And Joseph and I went there together for 1 month to explore paradoxes in Nordic art and to try and understand the contemporary Finnish art scene. So we visited many artists, we went to many photography and media collections, we went to the major museums, we went to small commercial galleries. We spent a month doing proper research about what we could find out. NIFKA also had a very good library. Again, the importance of a library to research. And we wrote this article, which is of interest to people who want to understand that particular situation in the late 90s, which was dominated in Finnish art by the growth of photography and new media approaches, and particularly performance art, which at the time Joseph was very interested in. So other features of the collection include these 3 catalogues, which are of his students' work. And there are actually many more catalogues of his students, because when the ICA started in 1988, but I think its foundation document is a few years later in 1991, Joseph took over Kabakos studio, very famous studio on the 6th floor of a building on Shretinsky Boulevard, and he used this space as an exhibition space, an office, and also a meeting house. And out of that meeting house or arrangement came the need for a school. And at the time, the first school that the ICA organized was actually funded by George Soros. And the Contemporary Art Strategies program, George Soros was very keen to invest, again, a post-perestroika phenomenon, which stopped in the 2000s. And Joseph's students continued to come every year. Every year he had new groups of students. He continued to work without Soros money. He started a very strong system of collaborations with other schools in Europe. This book, for example, is the Swedish art school, Valand, in Göteborg, which he had a close collaboration with for about 4 or 5 years, bringing students to Sweden and also bringing Swedish students to Russia. So this collaboration was very important. Then he took the students to London in 2011, and this show was organised by the Grad Gallery in London in 2011. It's very unusual to have a group of Russian students exhibiting in London, but Joseph did this. And this exhibition is an exhibition of the students' work in Moscow. It's another year and another group of students, and the theme is about time. So Joseph continued to profile his students' work. Several of them have been highly successful in international biennales. They have all pursued this internationalist approach to contemporary art because it is not possible or viable in today's culture to have a nationalist approach of any kind, either British or Russian or French approach to contemporary art. What we realize is that most artists who are living and working today travel extensively, work in several countries, have a nomadic existence. They are not they may be rooted in one culture and one country, but they are often working transnationally. And this is an absolutely essential feature of contemporary art, which has been developed since the 70s and is not going away soon. Okay, so what else should I talk about? I wanted to talk about the two books that Joseph did, one of which is a collection of his texts, and the other of which is a collection of his curatorial material. And the front cover of this book is very interesting, because the front cover of this book shows one of the most inventive and daring exhibitions that, again, he did in the post-perestroika period, which was to organize an exhibition in a prison in 1992, with the cooperation of the warden and with the assistance of the prisoners. He brought conceptual art to the prisoners for a dialogue and discussion, and they had an opening in the prison where guests were allowed into the prison to mingle with prisoners. This kind of approach originated from one of his earliest conceptual art exhibitions, which was the steamship action. And what a group of conceptual artists did in the avant-garde club, Clava as it's called, is they took over a boat. They filled the boat with audience and artists, and they organized a number of performance actions taking place on the boat for the 2 or 3 hour journey of the boat. And this steamship action in 1987 was the first major project that Joseph could be said to be the curator of. The other major project that he did in the late 80s, which is very noticeable, is the exhibition that he held in the Sandomierski baths. And there are photographs of the Sandomierski baths in here. And they organized an exhibition in the male part of the baths where people could swim as well as watch the art. And the opening is full of men in togas, wrapped very grandly, sort of looking at the art and swimming at the same time. So I just wanted to say that this feature of organizing exhibitions in different places in this city that Joseph really loved, and was very closely attached to, Moscow, is also a feature of how he organized the first exhibitions of the Moscow Biennale. The Moscow Biennale was not conceived in a museum. The Moscow Biennale was conceived as an intervention in Moscow as a city. And this is very important in reflecting on what the Moscow Biennale meant. And it was largely funded by the city of Moscow, I have to say. So the idea of the first Moscow Biennale was held in the Lenin Museum, which had been emptied as the historical museum. It's on Red Square. It had been emptied and no one was quite knowing what to do with it, and it was about to be renovated and restocked and reopened. So the first Moscow Biennale took place in a historical museum, but the distinctive feature of the first 6 biennales was their parallel program, because the whole point of a biennale is to activate the city. It is to bring visual arts on many levels throughout the city. And the idea of asking galleries around the city and non-exhibition spaces to open their space for art was a fundamental part of the conception of the Moscow Biennale. And you can also see in this catalogue an extensive parallel program of many exhibitions and many artists whose work was covered across the city. So the 6 catalogues of the Moscow Biennale reflect this, and they moved from, if I remember correctly, the Lenin Museum to Federation Tower, which at the time, the exhibition took place on the 22nd and 23rd floors, which had only just been built. And the exhibition took place in the bare structure of the building. And the day of the exhibition, the official lifts opened to that floor. That's how close it was to being newly built. Then the third exhibition was here, when it was the Museum of Garage. And the fourth exhibition was at Art Play. The fifth exhibition was at Manège, and the sixth exhibition was at Vedenka. So moving around the city and activating the city in different ways was fundamental to the Moscow Biennale. So just to give you some other insights, this was the first exhibition, Искусство, that Joseph ever organized abroad. And this exhibition has 3 editions, and there was an edition of this which was in Moscow, as well as Berlin. So this is the Berlin version of Искусство, and there were 2 more in Moscow, of an exchange between German and international artists in Germany and Russian artists. So again, the principles of exchange is the first order of the day. And this is a much later exhibition. This is 2005, and this is an international exhibition that Joseph held of Russian artists in Brussels at Europalia. Europalia was, Joseph worked very hard to try and integrate Russia into a European picture of culture. He was very interested in European picture of culture. He also organized an exhibition of Russian art in Japan. So he looked both ways, and he organized exhibition of the photographer Brakov in Sao Paulo. So, he wasn't just looking at the US or just looking at Europe. He was very interested in this kind of transnational exchange in many different dimensions. To go back to the importance of philosophy and theory, there is in Joseph's collection a very large collection of writing by Boris Groys. And Boris Groys was a Russian citizen who went to work in Germany and then America, and now is back in Germany. And he's a very important cultural theorist. So Joseph collected many of his books. But Joseph also has magazines, the Moscow Art Magazine, Ciné Divan, and this is just an example of one of Joseph's writings in here, because Joseph wrote some book reviews for this. And you will also find a few contributions of Joseph in the Moscow Art Magazine. He worked with Miziano. They organized an exhibition together in 2001 called On the Way to the Screen, which unfortunately didn't have a catalogue. He was also interested in links between, he always really wanted to hold an international conceptual art show. And he, in his archive at Pushkin Museum, there are quite a few references to him collecting names, pieces of information, research about other international conceptual artists to bring together a show. And this is a very early ICA catalogue, and it's also about his connections with America, because it's actually a British artist who was living in America, who was represented by an American gallery, the Ronald Feldman Gallery, and his close friend, Joseph's close friend, Andrei Monastersky, to hold an exhibition of those 2 artists in Moscow in 1990 and produce a tiny catalogue in English and Russian. Again, is another interesting feature of his collection. I don't know what else to talk about in relationship to art theory, but I would say about a third of the collection is art theory. And this includes really old historical books about, and there are quite a few old historical books about the problems of contemporary culture and cultural analysis of a city. And you can see in those older books later preoccupations of Joseph. So keeping those books was important to him. Everybody likes a clear out, but Joseph didn't clear out any of his books. He accumulated books which were directly of interest to his professional life. And you can also see in the collection a lot of his personal friendships, because people in the Moscow conceptual circle, he kept all their catalogues and he regularly collected them. And the other notable feature of the collection as a whole is the number of very small catalogues, because Joseph went regularly, obsessively to exhibition openings, and he went 2 or 3 times, to 2 or 3 in an evening. He didn't stop. And many people can tell you stories about rushing around Moscow with Joseph in a taxi from one venue to another. It was quite an adventure. But he was determined to see as much contemporary art as he could and to meet and network with as many people as he could. And this is another feature that you can see if you look across all these books. So you see books from all over the world, you see books in several languages, you see catalogues which are of exhibitions he went to, and he probably went to the openings of most of the exhibitions that you have the catalogues for, or helped to organize or advise someone about them, or included them in the parallel program, the Moscow Biennale, or networked with them when he was abroad, and they gave him a collection of catalogues representing their work. So all of those human relationships are very important to understand, because they're the things that actually have made this library what it is.